When I was younger, probably around 14 or 15 years old, my family used to camp at a state park every summer. We went to the same place every time. It was a quiet park, mostly just a bunch of big campsites separated by woods and trails. There weren't many people who stayed there during the week, especially not deeper into the park. It had a small lake, a few hiking trails, and one main loop road that connected all the campgrounds. No big touristy stuff, just basic picnic tables, fire rings, and outhouses. My parents liked it because it was cheap and quiet. I liked it because it felt like our own little world away from everything. My best friend would usually come along too. He was the same age as me. We'd known each other since kindergarten, lived on the same street, went to the same school. Our families were close, so it wasn't weird for us to go camping together. Those trips were some of my best memories. During the day, we'd hike around the trails or go fishing, but the nights were always the best part. We had this thing we called the ritual. Started as a dumb joke, but over the years it kind of became tradition. Every night, once it was dark enough, we'd take our flashlights and head out into the woods near our campsite. We didn't really go anywhere in particular. The point was just to walk through the woods in the dark, try not to get lost and freak each other out. Most nights we didn't even use the flashlights. We liked to try and see how far we could go with them turned off. Our eyes would adjust after a while, and the woods were just barely lit by moonlight if the sky was clear. Sounds kind of stupid now, but when we were kids, it made us feel brave. There was always that little bit of fear walking around out there, not knowing if we were going to trip over something or run into an animal. But that was the fun of it. We never went too far from camp, maybe a few hundred yards at most. We always figured we could find our way back, and so far we never had a real reason to worry. But there was one night where we pushed it further. That one night is the reason I still remember all of this as clearly as I do. It was late summer, maybe early August. The nights were still warm, but not so hot that you were sweating just standing still. That evening had been quiet. My parents cooked dinner over the fire, and we all sat around eating and talking. I remember it was chilly that night. My dad made a huge pot over the fire grate, and I ate way more than I should have. After dinner, my friend and I sat around the fire for a while before we got the itch to head out for the ritual. That night, for some reason, we decided to go further than we ever had before. It wasn't something we talked about or planned. It just happened. We started out like usual, walking along one of the rough foot trails that led off from our site. At first, we kept the flashlights off, letting our eyes adjust. The moon was out, but it was thin, and the sky had some high clouds drifting across it. The trees blocked most of the light anyway. We walked for a while in the dark, careful to watch our footing. The ground wasn't flat, and roots had a way of sneaking up on you. At some point, we turned the flashlights on just to be safe, but we kept them pointed low. We weren't really trying to scare ourselves that night. We were just bored. The trail eventually started to thin out, turning more into open forest with patches of tall grass and fallen logs. We didn't know exactly how far we had gone, but we figured we were probably half a mile from the nearest campsite. We couldn't hear any people anymore, no distant music or talking, just the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of some small animal. Then we heard it. Soft whispering came from behind us. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make both of us stop in our tracks. It was a dry kind of whisper, like someone saying something from just out of earshot, not trying to be heard. We spun around, hid our flashlights, and aimed them into the trees behind us. Nothing, just trees and underbrush. At first we thought maybe we were hearing wind through the trees, but there wasn't any wind. The air was still, thick. We stood there for a few seconds, waiting to hear it again, but it was quiet, so we shrugged it off and kept walking. About a minute later, we heard it again. Same direction, same kind of whispering. It made my stomach drop. There was something about it that felt wrong. Not just the sound itself, but the fact that it followed us. It wasn't random. It was coming from where we had just walked. This time we stopped longer. We aimed our flashlights back and scanned the area, moving slowly. I remember my pulse started to pick up. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. Both of us felt it. That's when we saw her. At first, I thought it was a pile of clothes or maybe an animal crawling through the grass. But then it moved in a way that was clearly human. It was a woman. She was crawling on her hands and knees through the underbrush. Her hair was tangled and hung in front of her face. She was whispering something, just random words and sounds. It didn't make any sense. She was wearing dark clothes that looked almost the same color as the dirt and leaves. Her skin was pale, and her hands were filthy. I couldn't see her eyes right away, but I remember the way her lips moved, like she was reciting something or just mumbling to herself. We both stood frozen. I didn't know what to do. Then she looked up. She stood up slowly, like her legs didn't want to work right. I could tell she was unsteady. She said something, I don't remember exactly what, but it was something about looking for her campsite. We just stood there, dumbstruck. Eventually, after what felt like a long moment of staring at each other, she started walking toward us. We didn't run. I think we were too surprised. When she got closer, I could smell alcohol on her. Not just beer, but that sour smell of someone who's been drinking for a long time. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she looked like she hadn't slept. She wasn't threatening or anything, just completely out of it. We started walking back toward the campground, and she followed behind us. She stumbled a few times but kept up. We didn't talk. We just kept walking until we started to see the glow of a few campfires through the trees. When we got back to the main loop road, we walked her around for a bit, trying to figure out which site was hers. Eventually, she recognized a car and wandered toward it. There were a few people sitting around a fire, and we realized they were her group. They didn't even notice she'd been gone. She plopped down in a camp chair and stared at the fire like nothing had happened. We didn't stick around. We walked back to our own campsite, sat down by the fire, and didn't say much for a while. My parents were in the tent by then. The fire was mostly embers. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about her crawling through the woods, whispering. If we hadn't gone that far out, if we just stuck to the usual path, we never would have found her. She could have spent the whole night out there, drunk, lost, crawling through the woods. It wasn't supernatural or anything like that, but it was real, and it scared me in a different way than anything else ever had. That feeling stuck with me. Even now, as an adult, I think about it sometimes when I'm walking alone at night or hear something that doesn't sound quite right in the woods. We never did the ritual again after that trip. We still camped a few more times over the years, but we stopped wandering off at night. It wasn't some kind of dramatic decision. It just didn't feel like a game anymore. It was too real, and that was enough. It happened about 10 years ago at Ginny Springs in Florida. I was in my mid-20s then. I'd been going camping off and on for years, mostly with friends or family, but sometimes solo. That weekend, I had a few days off work and decided I'd head out to the springs for a bit of quiet, maybe float the river, cook some food over the fire, get some fresh air. Nothing fancy, just a break from noise and schedules. It was something I used to do to reset my mind. I got to the campsite early on a Friday afternoon. The weather was good, hot but manageable. I picked a spot I liked, flat ground, a little shade from some trees, and not too close to the bathrooms. It was far enough from the bigger groups of people but not so isolated that I'd be completely on my own. You get a mix of campers out there, families, partiers, couples, and the crowd was light that weekend. I had neighbors, but they weren't right on top of me. I took my time setting up, threw up my tent, staked it down good, set up a small table and camp chair, and gathered some wood from the stand they keep near the road. I had a small cooler and a backpack with the basics, canned food, a pan, a flashlight, lighter, all the usual stuff. I walked down to the water before sunset, floated around for a bit. Water was clear, cold. Not much else to it. That night was calm. Warm breeze, some bugs but not too bad. And I drifted off easy after dinner and some quiet time by the fire. I remember thinking it was one of the better camping nights I'd had in a while. No loud people, no problems. Just the kind of quiet you come out for. The next day was more of the same. I did some reading, walked a trail near the springs, took a swim, made lunch, then rested a bit in the afternoon heat. That evening, more campers started rolling in. You could hear tents being set up, music drifting through the trees, coolers being popped open. Nothing too wild, just the usual weekend crowd starting to settle in. A couple families nearby had kids who were riding bikes and chasing each other around. I heard one group playing a game with glow sticks after dark. That night, I went to bed around 11. I always zip up everything tight. Tent closed, food stored up, flashlight near my pillow. The woods had gone quiet again. Just the steady hum of insects and the occasional crack of a branch as an animal moved through. I don't know exactly what time it was when I heard it. Late, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning. It was a sound that cut right through sleep, that kind of booming crack and thud you only hear in the movies. For a second, I didn't know what I was hearing. I wasn't fully awake, and my brain hadn't caught up to the sound yet. But then I realized a tree had come down. You hear about that kind of thing now and then. Old trees, storm-weakened limbs, bad roots. Sometimes they drop without much warning. Sometimes they fall fast. This one sounded massive. I could feel the vibration in the ground, even inside my sleeping bag. At first, I just laid there, frozen, listening. After the echo of the fall faded, everything went silent again. Dead quiet. That's what was weirdest. Not even crickets for a few seconds. Then, slowly, noise started returning. I heard a few distant voices, confused, muffled. Maybe someone shouting. I unzipped the tent and stuck my head out. My flashlight beam bounced off the trees and the gravel of the path near my sight. I didn't see anything right away, but then I noticed a couple of other campers stepping out of their tents too. Some of them doing what I was, scanning the area, trying to figure out what had just happened. The voices got louder, more movement. Someone ran past, headed in the direction the sound came from. I didn't know what to do at first. I stood there a while, just outside my tent, watching as more lights came on across the campground. It was maybe 5 minutes before I walked toward the noise, drawn more by instinct than any real plan. About 100 yards from my sight, I saw a crowd forming. People were gathered near one of the smaller sites that had been set up earlier that evening. A couple of tents there, one big enough for a family, the other smaller. And the tree, huge, maybe 3 feet across at the base with thick limbs and dead bark, was sprawled straight across one side of the site. The tree had fallen right across the smaller tent. Some people were already trying to help. Flashlights pointed at the wreckage, hands on phones. Someone was yelling for a ranger, but the closest staff station was probably over a mile away. A few folks were trying to pull limbs off the tent, but it was clear pretty quickly it was too late. The tent was crushed flat in the middle. You could see where the main trunk had hit. It took a long time for help to come. A ranger arrived after what felt like 20 minutes. He took a quick look and radioed for emergency services. Then the waiting started. People had gathered in a big ring, not getting too close, staying quiet. The mood had shifted completely. You could feel the weight of what had happened settle on everyone. No one knew who was in the tent at first. It turned out to be a solo camper, a guy maybe in his 30s, who had arrived late and set up by himself. The ranger found his ID. Some people said they'd seen him earlier reading by a lantern. An ambulance showed up about 40 minutes after the call. Then, about an hour after that, a helicopter arrived. They circled a few times before landing in a clearing near the access road. It was loud, and the wind kicked up sand and dust through the trees. By then, the tree had been partially moved with the help of some equipment the park staff brought in. It didn't matter much. The man was already gone. They lifted him out with care and loaded him into the chopper. Then the campgrounds went quiet again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the cold fire, listening to the woods, watching the stars. There wasn't much to think about, just the randomness of it. One tree, one tent, one person. If he'd set up 6 feet to the left or chosen a different site or decided to stay home. None of us knew what to do with that kind of chance. The next morning, people were packing up fast. Sites emptied out quicker than usual. I did the same. Didn't even make breakfast, just tore down the tent, threw everything in the car, and drove off. I passed a ranger truck near the entrance, and they were already putting up caution tape near that part of the campground. I've been back to Ginny Springs since. Not often, but a couple times. I never set up near that area anymore. I checked the trees a lot more carefully than I used to. I've camped a lot since then, and I still love being outside. But that night changed something. It stuck with me, not just the sound of the tree falling, but the way everything changed after. The silence, the way people gathered, the helplessness of it, and how, even surrounded by all those people, that guy had died alone under a tree in the middle of the night. We like to think we're in control when we go out into the woods. We pick our spots, pack the right gear, follow the rules. But nature doesn't care about any of that. Trees fall, storms roll in, accidents happen, and sometimes there's nothing you can do. That night was just another reminder of how small we really are when the woods go quiet and the dark closes in. I was in my late 20s when I started guiding safaris full-time in the South African lowveld. It wasn't glamorous, at least not in the way people imagined it. Sure, you saw beautiful animals, spectacular landscapes, and experienced nature in a way most people never would. But it was also long hours, dust in your lungs, unpredictable weather, and moments of real danger that no training could fully prepare you for. That particular winter had been especially brutal. Cold nights weren't uncommon in the bush, but this season had been colder than most. We were in the middle of a week-long walking safari, a style of guiding where you hike during the day and camp in remote, unfenced spots at night. It was meant to give guests a raw, close-to-the-earth kind of experience, and honestly, it was my favorite kind. We had a small group, just me, my buddy Pete, who was another guide, and 4 guests from Europe. They were hardy and respectful, the kind who listened to directions and didn't treat the wilderness like their personal playground. That night, we set up camp near a dried-out riverbed. It was a place Pete and I had used before. Flat terrain, some brush to provide cover from the wind, and a view of the open plain beyond. We pitched simple dome tents, enough to give some privacy but nothing fancy. Everyone knew to zip up tight at night, keep food sealed, and not to wander off. Lions, hyenas, leopards, they were out here, and tents were nothing more than a psychological barrier if an animal really wanted in. We had a small fire going while we cooked dinner. I remember it clearly because the stars were incredible that night, so bright they didn't even look real. The guests turned in early, worn out from the day's hike. Pete and I sat a while longer, watching the flames die down and listening to the calls of night birds, insects, and the distant yips of jackals. Eventually, we put the last of the embers out and crawled into our own tents. I had my sleeping bag unzipped and wrapped around me. Even inside the tent, it was freezing. The canvas offered no rail insulation, just a shield from wind and dew. I curled up, pulling my fleece down over my face and tried to drift off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The bush at night doesn't go silent, but you learn to recognize different sounds. What's normal, what's not. This wasn't a noise that woke me. It was heat. My back was warm, too warm. It felt like I had scooted up against a heater, except there was no heater. I opened my eyes but didn't move. I couldn't immediately tell what was happening. All I knew was that something large and warm was pressed against the canvas of my tent, right behind me. My tent wall shifted ever so slightly with the rise and fall of its breathing. Slow, deep, rhythmic. At first, my sleepy mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe Pete was up and had come over for some reason? But no, this wasn't a person. The body mass was wrong. It wasn't flat like someone sitting or lying down. It was rounded, broad, muscular. There was a slight smell too earthy, but not foul. Not quite sweat, not quite fur. It was the smell of an animal. A few seconds later, I heard a faint voice from the tent about 10 feet away. Pete. His voice was low and tight, like he was trying not to startle something. He called out my name quietly just once. There was tension in it I hadn't heard before. That's when it really clicked. If Pete was in his tent, then whatever was outside mine wasn't him. I should have stayed quiet, should have thought more, but I responded instinctively too loudly. The shape behind me shifted, then stood up. My whole tent rustled. I felt the weight of the thing lifting off the side. There was a slight grunt, then heavy footsteps moving away, calm but purposeful. No rush, just slow, deliberate steps crunching through dry grass and twigs. I waited a long time before moving. Every second dragged. When I finally got the courage to unzip my tent just an inch, I peeked out. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something had been there, something big. I stepped out slowly, ears straining. The cold bit through my clothes, but I didn't care. Pete was already out, crouched near his tent with a flashlight in hand. We didn't need to speak. We both knew. He gestured with his hand and pointed to a trail in the grass, barely visible in the starlight. We followed it a bit, maybe 50 yards, before the prints became clear. Lion tracks, fresh, massive. There was no denying it now. A male lion had lain down right next to my tent in the night, probably for warmth. It made sense in a wild sort of way. Canvas tents trap heat, even if it's just a little, and a lion looking for a warm spot could easily find comfort in the side of a tent with a sleeping human inside. We didn't wake the guests. There was no point. The lion was gone, and they'd only be terrified if they knew. We stood watch the rest of the night, taking turns with our rifles across our laps. But nothing else came close. The next morning, we checked the tracks more thoroughly. The lion had circled camp once, lay down for who knows how long, then moved off into the bush. No aggression, no curiosity beyond a warm place to rest. It hadn't scratched or nudged, just lay there like a house cat curled by a radiator. I thought about how easily it could have ended differently. If I had screamed, moved suddenly, unzipped the tent at the wrong moment. Who knows? I've had a lot of close encounters in the bush. Charging elephants, curious hyenas, snakes too near the sleeping bag. But that moment, that strange warmth against my back, the weight of something so powerful and wild resting without a sound. It shook me. The rest of the safari went without incident. The guests never knew. Pete and I didn't even talk much about it afterward. We didn't need to, but I've never forgotten that night. Since then, I've changed how I camp. I use thicker canvas. I never sleep right up against the edge. And I always remind myself, out here we're visitors. Quiet, temporary visitors in a land that doesn't care who we are. And sometimes the wild gets closer than we think. I was never one of those people who camped every weekend or went off-grid for days just for the thrill of it. I like the outdoors in the same way most people do. A short hike here and there, maybe some fishing if the weather was nice, and then back home where the floors were flat and the air conditioning worked. But that summer, something was different. I was burnt out from work, tired of staring at screens all day, and I felt this constant pressure in my chest that wouldn't go away no matter how much I slept or how much coffee I drank. Everything felt loud. My apartment felt like it was closing in on me. That's when I decided to go camping alone. I didn't want company, I didn't want to hear anyone talking, and I definitely didn't want to see another building for a while. I picked a spot in a state forest about 4 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a campground, not exactly. It was one of those primitive camping areas, no power, no toilets, no people. Just a dirt pull-off from a winding gravel road and a few flat spots near the tree line where you could pitch a tent. It was technically allowed, just not exactly popular. That was the whole point. I left on a Thursday morning in mid-June. The weather was supposed to be decent all week. Clear skies, warm but not hot. I brought a small tent, a decent sleeping bag, a camping stove, a couple gallons of water, and enough food for 3 days. I also had a cheap folding knife I kept in my glove box and a small hatchet for firewood. I didn't bring a gun, though I thought about it. I didn't have one I felt comfortable with, and I figured the worst I might run into was a raccoon trying to steal my cooler. I reached the spot around 1 in the afternoon. The drive into the forest was beautiful. The road twisted through dense trees, and the deeper I went, the less cell service I had. That part didn't bother me. I wanted to disconnect anyway. When I reached the pull-off, it was completely empty. No other vehicles, no signs of people. I parked my car so it was facing back the way I came, just in case I needed to leave quickly. That's something I always do. I don't know where I picked it up. I found a flat area about 50 feet from the edge of the clearing, under a patch of tall pines. It was shaded and soft with layers of needles and moss. I set up my tent there, laid out my sleeping bag, and put my food in a cooler next to the tree stump I planned to use as a table. The sun was warm, the air smelled like sap and dirt, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The first night was uneventful. I made some instant noodles on the camp stove, watched the light fade through the trees, and crawled into my sleeping bag when it got too dark to see without a flashlight. The forest was loud. Crickets, frogs, the occasional snap of a twig in the distance, but nothing that felt threatening. I was tired from the drive and fell asleep fast. I woke up once in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving near the tent. Not close, but maybe 10 or 15 yards off. It didn't sound big, just slow footsteps, maybe a deer or a raccoon sniffing around. I stayed still, listening for a few minutes, but the sound moved away. I drifted back to sleep and didn't think much of it. The next day, I hiked for a few hours, following a narrow trail I found near the clearing. It wasn't marked, probably an old game trail, but it was easy enough to follow. The forest was deep, thicker than it looked from the road, and after about 2 hours of walking, I turned around. I didn't want to get lost, and I hadn't brought my compass or any real navigation gear. Another mistake I noticed later. I got back to my camp in the early afternoon and sat on the stump with a can of chili and a warm bottle of water. Everything felt still and quiet, except for the bugs and birds. That evening, just before sunset, I started gathering wood for a small fire. I wasn't planning to stay up late, but I figured it would be good to keep warm and keep the bugs off. I was maybe 30 yards from my tent, dragging some dead branches over my shoulder, when I noticed something strange in the dirt. There was a mark in the soil, not a footprint exactly, more like a dragged line, as if someone had scraped a stick or a toe across the ground, curved slightly, then disappeared into the brush. I knelt down to look at it, and for a second I thought maybe it was a snake trail, but it was too wide and too uneven. It gave me a weird feeling. Not fear, just confusion. I stood up and looked around. Nothing. The forest was just trees and undergrowth and the path I'd made walking back and forth. I shook it off and went back to my camp. The fire was nice. I sat next to it for a while, picking at a granola bar and watching the flames flicker in the breeze. I heard something again that night. Not footsteps, but a thump, like something hitting the ground hard. It came from the same direction as the weird mark. I stood up and shined my flashlight that way, but the beam only cut through about 20 feet of trees before it was swallowed by the dark. I waited. Nothing moved. I told myself it was a branch falling. That's what it sounded like. I went to bed later than the night before. Fire burned down to ash, the woods still humming with life. I kept the hatchet next to my sleeping bag, just in case. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that was too close. It wasn't an animal. It was a breath, slow and heavy, just outside the tent wall. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. It was right there, 6 inches away, separated from me by thin nylon and mesh. I could hear it shift its weight, like it was crouching. Then, just as slowly as it came, the sound moved away. No footsteps, just less breath. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. When the sun came up, I got out of the tent and looked around. Nothing was disturbed. No prints, no signs of anything walking by. But I knew what I'd heard. I thought maybe it was someone messing with me, some weirdo who'd stumbled on my camp. But that didn't make sense either. There were no tire tracks on the road, no voices, no sign anyone else had been around. I should have packed up then. I should have left. But I told myself it was probably my imagination. Maybe I dreamed it. Maybe I heard my own breathing echoing weirdly in the tent. I've never been great at trusting my instincts. I spent the third day mostly near camp. I didn't hike. I didn't wander. I just sat on the stump with my back to a tree, facing the direction where the breathing had come from. I had my knife in my hand most of the day. I didn't use it, just held it. The woods felt different, still loud, but tense, like it was holding its breath. I saw a squirrel freeze halfway up a tree, its head cocked like it heard something too. Late that afternoon, I noticed another mark. This one was closer to camp. A drag through the pine needles, longer this time, like something had been pulled across the ground. I followed it about 10 feet before it vanished under a pile of leaves. I dug with my boot, but there was nothing under them, just dirt. Still, something about it didn't sit right. That night, I didn't build a fire. I didn't cook. I didn't even unzip my tent until I had to pee just before dark, and I did that 10 feet from the door with my knife in one hand. I zipped the tent shut as soon as I got back in and laid there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, every sound amplified. I didn't sleep. Not really. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was metal, a soft click, then another. Took me a few seconds to place it. The cooler. Someone was opening my cooler. I bolted upright and grabbed my flashlight and hatchet. I unzipped the door just a few inches and shined the beam out. The cooler was open. The lid was leaning against the tree. One of the food wrappers was a few feet away, like it had been thrown or dropped. But there was no one there. I stepped out of the tent slowly. Every hair on my body felt like it was standing straight up. I circled the tent once, then twice, scanning every shadow. Still nothing. I picked up the cooler and carried it into the tent with me, setting it down next to the sleeping bag. I sat there the rest of the night, flashlight in one hand, hatchet in the other, barely blinking. When the sky finally started to lighten, I packed everything. Fast. I didn't even try to fold the tent. Just stuffed it into the trunk and slammed it shut. I poured out the water, tossed the food wrappers, and left the cooler. I just wanted to get out. As I drove down the gravel road, I saw something in the ditch about a quarter mile from the pull-off. It looked like a shoe. I slowed down. It was a hiking boot. Old, muddy, partially buried in leaves. Next to it was something that looked like a ripped strap from a backpack. I didn't stop. I didn't get out. I just kept driving. When I got back to the main road and my cell service came back, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, trying to decide what to do. I thought about calling the police, reporting the boot, but what would I even say? I heard breathing outside my tent. There were drag marks in the dirt. I didn't even know where I'd been exactly. No coordinates, no mile markers. I didn't make the call. I told myself it was probably trash. Someone dropped a boot years ago, and an animal dragged it to the ditch. That's what I told myself. I never went back to that forest. I haven't been camping alone since. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm walking. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend for me. I'd been hiking and camping solo for a few years by then. Nothing extreme, just long trails, remote valleys, and a lot of time spent away from everything and everyone. This time, I was somewhere out west, a tucked-away valley I'd been tipped off about from a ranger in a nearby town. No cell service, no marked sites, just raw land. I'd spent most of the day on a winding trail that climbed up and curved down into that valley. It had taken longer than I'd planned. I tend to lose track of time when I hike alone, especially in places like that where every bend in the trail offers a new view and a fresh reason to keep going. The sun was low when I realized I wasn't going to make it back to where I originally planned to camp. That's when I ran into the guy. He was probably in his 50s, wore a hat with a patch sewn onto it, and carried a small pack that looked worn but solid. He was local, lived in one of the small towns not far from the trailhead. We talked for a bit. He seemed decent enough. He told me about a camping spot closer to the river and near the road. Said it was hidden, kind of camouflaged by trees and brush. He even walked me halfway there. I took him at his word and made my way in. It was already dim enough that I didn't want to waste time looking for another spot. The place was actually really good. Flat, soft ground, some big rocks for a fire pit, and a slight elevation that overlooked the river. There was a narrow dirt road maybe 30 yards back through the brush, but it couldn't be seen unless you stood at just the right angle. I got a fire going, pulled a few beers from the cooler in my truck, and popped in my headphones. I was listening to a comedy podcast some friends of mine recorded. Something light and familiar to end the night with. The fire crackled. My laughter mixed with the voices in my ears, and I felt far removed from anything serious. I wasn't being quiet either. I didn't care. I was relaxed. I never even got around to pitching my tent. With the fire going and my gear already in the back of the truck, I decided I'd just sleep under the topper. Less hassle. I liked being off the ground anyway, and there's something oddly comforting about being closed in by the truck shell. I climbed in, laid back against my bag, and drifted off with the voices from the podcast still echoing faintly in my ears. I woke up at dawn. Cold air seeped in through the cracks, and I could see my breath. Everything was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you hold your breath to preserve it. The fire was out. I climbed out of the back, stretched a bit, and got a new fire going. Cracked another beer. I wasn't in a rush. I like slow mornings out there. No notifications, no obligations, just the sounds of the world waking up around you. I was digging around for a pan to cook some eggs when I noticed movement in the brush ahead of me. I looked up, expecting maybe a deer, maybe even another hiker cutting through. But no, it was a man. He was standing maybe 20 feet away, right at the edge of the trees. Not hiding exactly, but not stepping forward either. He wasn't looking at me. In fact, that was one of the strangest things. He kept his head turned just slightly off to the side, like someone listening to a sound far away. He looked rough. Dirty clothes, a long, matted beard, and plastic grocery bags tied all over his jacket and pants. Dozens of them. Some looked like they were filled with something. Others just crinkled as he moved slightly. I made some casual noises, nothing too confrontational, just trying to feel out the situation. But he didn't respond. He just kind of drifted slowly to one side, still near the edge of my camp, never stepping closer than maybe 15 feet. Not once did he look directly at me. It was early, and my brain was still fogged a little from sleep and beer, but it didn't take long for things to click in my head. Something wasn't right. Not just the appearance. It was his movement, his silence, the way he paced like someone trapped inside their own mind. I tried to offer him food. I tried a beer. Nothing. I could feel my heart thudding harder in my chest. There's a certain instinct that kicks in, like your body catching on to danger before your thoughts catch up. I didn't know if he was mentally ill, on drugs, or just dangerous. I only knew that I was alone, hidden from the road, with no cell service and a stranger standing right on the edge of my camp. I kept the bear spray right next to me along with my knife. I'd packed the night before with my gear, and I'd placed them both within arm's reach when I went to sleep. Just habit. I didn't even think I'd need them, but I did now. The guy never came closer, but he wouldn't leave either. He'd drift a few feet one way, then back, all without turning toward me. It was like he was pretending I wasn't there. I tried again to speak, to get a reaction. Still nothing. That was it for me. I got up slowly, took hold of the bear spray, and stood up tall. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I just walked forward a few steps, steady and with purpose. It was like something snapped in him. He turned and sulked away, back into the brush. No sudden movement, no reaction to me, just a slow shuffle away from camp. I waited a minute watching the brush. Then I turned and threw everything I had into the back of the truck. The food was still half cooked. I didn't even shut off the stove properly. I just tossed it all into the bed, closed the tailgate, and got behind the wheel. The engine started up with a sound I hadn't realized I needed to hear so badly. As I drove away down the narrow dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Nothing. No movement. Just trees and dust. But even miles later, with full sunlight pouring through the windshield, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched all night. That maybe he'd been nearby the whole time. Maybe he saw me laughing by the fire, heard the voices from the podcast and thought I wasn't alone. Maybe he was just waiting. I didn't stop until I was back in town. I went straight to a gas station with people inside, bought a coffee, and just sat for a while in the parking lot. I never called the police. What would I have said? A guy in the woods didn't talk to me, but I never went back to that spot. I still camp. I still hike alone, but I trust my gut more now. And I always sleep in the truck if I'm alone. That laziness probably saved me that night. If I'd been in a tent, I don't know how things would have gone. I don't like to think about it too much. Some people go into the woods looking for peace and get exactly that. Others go in looking for something else. You just hope your paths don't cross. But mine did that night, and it reminded me that the scariest thing out there isn't wolves or bears or mountain lions. It's people. The ones who walk the edges of your camp and act like you don't even exist. I went out for a solo camping trip one weekend, mostly because I needed to clear my head. Work had been piling up, I was getting sick of people, and I hadn't had proper quiet in a long time. I didn't want a campsite with families and caravans and the buzz of generators at night. I wanted the bush, somewhere quiet, somewhere a bit out of the way. I found a spot on some public land not far from a national park, about 3 hours' drive from home. It wasn't a designated campsite, just a patch of secluded bushland I found using satellite maps and some hiking forums. It was legal to camp there, and that's all I needed. When I arrived, it was mid-afternoon. The dirt track leading in was rough and narrow, lined with gum trees and scrub, and I had to park about 200 meters from where I planned to set up. I walked the last bit with my gear on foot. There were no signs of recent campers. The ground was dry, covered in thick leaf litter and broken branches. I liked that. It meant I'd be able to hear anything moving around, critters, roosts, people. That was part of why I chose this place. The stillness. The way sound carries through dry bush when the undergrowth is crackly and brittle. I found a flat spot just off a slight ridge where the trees opened up a bit. No visibility from the road, and a good line of sight in all directions. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made a small campfire ring with stones. I had a lightweight gas burner too, but I always liked the comfort of a fire at night. Even if I didn't cook on it, the smell of the smoke, the glow of the coals, it always made me feel grounded. As the sun started dipping, I boiled some water for a tea and sat back against a log to enjoy the quiet. There were a few birds still moving around, their calls sharp in the cooling air, but nothing else. No wind, no traffic, no voices, just silence. Even the insects were subdued. It was the kind of place that made you feel like time had slowed right down. I stayed up for a while after dark, listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional scurry of a possum or something small in the undergrowth. I had a headlamp, but I tried not to use it too much. I didn't want to draw attention, and the moon was just enough to see by. Eventually, I put the fire out, zipped myself into the tent, and lay back in my sleeping bag. It was warm enough not to need much cover, and the sound of nothing lulled me to sleep faster than I expected. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It felt like the middle of the night, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. The air had cooled right down, and the walls of the tent were slightly damp with condensation. I didn't open my eyes right away. Something had pulled me out of sleep, but it wasn't obvious at first what it was. No loud noises, no lights, just a strange sensation that something had changed. Then I heard it, a sound I couldn't place at first. A single wet plop, like something soft and heavy dropping onto the ground. Not a stick snapping or an animal scurrying. Just that one noise. No follow-up. No movement afterward. Just quiet again. I lay still, trying to listen harder, but there was nothing. No wind. No footsteps. No rustling in the leaves. If it had been a roo or a wallaby, I would have heard the hops or the brushing of leaves. If it had been a person, I would have heard twigs snapping, something crunching underfoot, but there was absolutely nothing. I waited for what felt like a long time, ears straining, heart starting to race, but still nothing. Eventually, I shifted in my bag and unzipped the side of the tent just enough to poke my head out. I didn't turn on my torch. I didn't want to light myself up if someone was out there. The moon was bright enough to see a few meters in all directions. The bush was still. My gear was where I left it. The campfire ring was cold. Nothing looked out of place. I zipped the tent closed again and told myself it was probably a big gum nut falling, or maybe a branch dropping somewhere nearby. Weird acoustics in the bush can make things sound closer or stranger than they are. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't fall back asleep properly. I drifted in and out, keeping my ears open, until the light started changing and I could see the outline of the trees through the tent fabric. The birds started up again, their early calls breaking the quiet. When I finally unzipped the tent and looked out, I immediately felt my stomach turn. About half a meter from the tent door, just to the right of where I'd walked in and out, was a kangaroo's head. Just the head, cleanly severed, lying on its side, eyes half open, blood dried into the dirt and leaf litter. It hadn't been there when I set up. It hadn't been there when I went to sleep. And there was no way I missed it during the night if it had just wandered into camp and died there. The plop I'd heard, that had to be it. But there was no sound of it being dragged in. No blood trail. Nothing around it disturbed. Just the head clean and out of place. I stood frozen for a moment, then stepped slowly around it, checking the area. Nothing else. No prints I could see, though the dry ground wouldn't show much. No marks on the tent. No sign of anything moved or taken. Just that head. It wasn't old or decayed. The fur was clean, no maggots, no flies buzzing. Fresh, but not bleeding, like it had been cut clean and placed there. Intentionally. I didn't waste time packing up properly. I shoved my gear into my pack, skipped breakfast, and doused the area where the fire had been. I didn't bother folding the tent, just stuffed it into its bag. I was shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting something or someone to step out from the trees, but nothing came. Still that eerie, unnatural quiet. I made it back to the car and drove the hell out of there. Didn't stop until I hit a petrol station back near the highway. Didn't talk to anyone. Just sat in the car with the engine running, trying to calm down. It didn't feel like something I could report. What would I say? That someone left a ruse head next to my tent in the middle of the bush? They'd think I was overreacting or making it up. But I know what I saw. I know it wasn't there when I went to sleep. And I know something put it there. I haven't been camping alone since then. I've done group hikes, day trips, but not solo bush camping. Not after that. There's no explanation that fits. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't an accident. Someone carried a decapitated kangaroo's head into the bush in the middle of the night, stepped quietly enough not to wake me up, and left it next to my tent without leaving a sound or a trail. That's not something that just happens. It wasn't a ghost or a cryptid or any of that nonsense. It was a person, a real person, and whatever reason they had for doing it, I didn't want to stick around and find out. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I'd opened the tent when I first heard the noise, if I'd shown my torch around, if I'd caught someone in the act. Part of me wants to know who would do something like that, but the bigger part of me is glad I didn't. I don't need to know. I just needed to get out, and I did. That was enough. Back in high school, probably around our final year, a small group of us decided to go on a camping trip before things got too serious with exams and whatever life was going to throw at us after graduation. There were 5 of us, me, Aaron, Josh, Matt, and Tyler. We all lived in the same town, one of those quiet places near the edge of the ranges, and the bush wasn't far out. It was the kind of place where you could walk a few hours and feel like you were deep in the middle of nowhere. That's what we wanted. Total isolation, real nature, no phone service. Something we could remember. We picked a spot on the map, up near one of the ridgelines, and planned a route. It wasn't an official trail or anything, just bush, scrub, and elevation. We took old topo maps and a compass, packed up our stuff, tents, sleeping bags, food, torches, knives, and set off early one Friday morning. The weather was decent, a bit warm but not stinking hot. Clear skies. The hike was harder than we thought it'd be. Not just steep, but uneven. Thick undergrowth in places, a lot of loose rocks. You had to watch every step. We stopped for breaks pretty often and pushed through the day, aiming to make camp by sundown. There was this rough clearing near the top of one of the ridges, and we figured that'd give us good ground for setting up and maybe a decent view. When we got there, just before sunset, it looked perfect. Dry, flat enough for tents, no dead trees hanging over us. We all dropped our packs and sat for a while, catching our breath. Everyone was sweaty and tired. We didn't do much after that. Just pitched the tents, boiled some noodles, and sat around until it got too dark to see without a torch. There was no fire. We didn't bring gear for that, and it wasn't safe anyway with the leaf litter all around. The bush was thick with it, dry sticks and bark and leaves, so thick that every step you took sounded like something breaking. Even at night, you could tell if something was moving around. That kind of noise cuts through everything. We eventually turned in not long after 9. The hike had killed our energy, and no one felt like staying up in the dark with nothing but headlamps and mozzies for company. I crawled into my tent, unrolled my bag, stripped down a bit to cool off, and lay there for a while listening. The others were settling in. I could hear them zipping their tents shut, rustling in their bags, the occasional cough or sigh. Then it went quiet, really quiet. Out there, away from roads and towns, silence feels different. It's not empty, it's heavy. You lie there and you start hearing every little creak of fabric, every breath you take. You realize how loud your own heartbeat can sound in the dead of night. But what gets you most is when something breaks that silence, because you know there's no one else around. I don't know how long I'd been asleep. Could have been half an hour, could have been 2 hours. But I woke up to the sound outside the tent. Not loud, but not quiet either. A crunch, like something stepping on dry twigs. Then another, and another, but not in a line, not like one animal walking. They were in different spots. One behind me, one to the left, another off to the front. I lay there still, holding my breath, listening. The sounds came again. Crunch, crunch. Then nothing. Then again. A bit closer. I knew the bush was full of animals, but this didn't sound like possums or bandicoots. It didn't sound like a single creature moving around. It sounded like several, and heavy like weighty steps, deliberate, measured, surrounding us. I felt something cold settle in my gut. I didn't move at first, just kept still and listened, hoping it would stop, hoping it was in my head. But it didn't. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of something or some things, stepping slowly through the litter all around the tent. I could hear them pausing, starting again, sometimes 2 or 3 steps at once from different directions. The tent was zipped, but I didn't want to make any noise. I didn't want to unzip it too quickly and draw attention. But I couldn't lie there and do nothing. I slowly reached over to my pack and found my torch. I kept it off and waited, tried to breathe steady. Still the sounds kept coming, closer now, like whatever was out there was almost at the tent walls. I braced myself, then unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. I poked the flashlight through the flap and clicked it on. For a second, I couldn't see anything but the beam lighting up the nearest trees, shadows and trunks. Then I moved it slowly, sweeping across the undergrowth. That's when I saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, not glowing red or anything weird, just shining in the torchlight like mirrors. Reflected light, animal eyes, but they weren't low to the ground like you'd expect from wallabies or wombats. They were high, almost eye level with me, spaced apart like heads. Some were closer than others. Some looked higher than others, but they weren't moving. They just stood there, silent, watching. I froze. I couldn't even think. Just kept the light on them, afraid to turn it off, afraid to blink. My mind was racing with every possible animal it could be. Maybe people, but they didn't move. They didn't speak. They didn't shift or shuffle. Just stood there with those eyes catching the light. Eventually, after what felt like forever, one of them turned. Then another. They moved with that same deliberate slowness, stepping away through the sticks. I could hear it again, the crunching of dry leaves and bark underfoot. Then more of them moved, one by one, until they were gone. I sat there, hand shaking around the torch, not knowing what to do. I didn't wake the others. I didn't make a sound. I zipped the tent back up and sat there, still holding the light. I don't think I slept again that night. I just sat and listened. By the time morning came, the others were waking up and stretching, yawning and talking like nothing had happened. The light made everything look normal again. Trees, scrub, sunlight cutting through the canopy. No sign of anything strange. No footprints or disturbed ground. I didn't say much while we packed up. I kept looking out into the bush, trying to spot anything odd. But it was like nothing had happened. Later, on the hike back, I finally mentioned I thought I saw something in the night. One of the boys laughed and said I probably saw a wallaby or something. But I know wallabies don't stand shoulder height and move in groups like that. A few weeks later, I looked it up. Based on the height of the eyes and the number of them, I figured out what it was. Deer. Feral deer. A whole herd. Probably somber or red deer. They move silent most of the time, but they're big animals. At night, their eyes shine back bright in torchlight, and they do freeze when you light them up. They don't spook easy when they're not used to people. I'd never even thought about deer being out there, but turns out they've been spreading fast in that part of the state especially in areas where no one really goes. We must have camped right near where they were bedding down or feeding. Still, that moment, when all I could see were those eyes, burned itself into my memory. It didn't matter that it was just deer. In that second, in that darkness, my brain went somewhere else. Somewhere deep and old and scared. It wasn't some monster. It wasn't a ghost or killer. But it was the unknown. And in the bush, that's enough. I've been camping since then, plenty of times. But I always keep a torch close now. And I always listen to the sounds outside the tent, especially when they stop. I drove out to the national forest alone, which wasn't unusual for me. I've been camping solo for years and never had a real problem. I liked the quiet, the time to think, the space away from everything. I had a little spot I always went to, far enough off the trail that no one ever stumbled past. It was next to a small creek and shaded by tall pines. It was about a 2-hour hike from where I parked my truck. That afternoon, the weather was clear, maybe a little too warm for spring, but nothing to complain about. I had my pack filled with the usual: tent, food, water, filter, bear spray, and a first aid kit. I left the truck around noon and made it to the spot by 2. It was the same as I remembered: peaceful, empty, quiet except for the birds and the wind. I took my time setting up the tent, rolling out my mat and sleeping bag, getting the fire ring ready, collecting some dry sticks. I always pack a little hatchet for that. I filtered some water from the creek, checked for ticks, then stretched out in the sun for a while. Felt good to be out there again. I hadn't been camping since the fall. I cooked dinner before dark. Just one of those freeze-dried meals and some instant coffee. It didn't taste great, but out there everything kind of tastes better. I had my little fire going, just enough to keep warm. The woods were quiet, and I hadn't seen or heard a single person since I left the truck. I went to bed early, sometime around 9. It got colder fast after sunset. I zipped up inside my bag, left the rain fly off the tent so I could see the stars. I was out quick. That's one of the things I love about being outside, real sleep. I woke up sometime in the night, not from a sound exactly, more like a feeling. That sort of heavy silence that doesn't seem natural. I lay still and listened. I didn't hear anything at first. No wind, no insects. Then I heard a branch snap. Not close, not far either, maybe 30 yards off. A clean, loud break, like someone stepped on it. I stayed still, hoping it was a deer. I reached slowly for the bear spray I always keep beside my sleeping bag. I didn't uncap it yet, just held it. Another snap. Closer. I sat up inside the tent. I didn't want to make noise, didn't want to unzip the tent and shine a light. That would make it worse if it was a person, or an animal that might charge at movement. I stayed frozen, listening. Then silence again. No steps, no more breaks. I sat there for at least 10 minutes, bear spray in hand, trying not to breathe too loud. Nothing. Eventually, I lay back down but didn't fall asleep again. I stayed that way until dawn. As soon as it was light, I got up, unzipped the tent, and stepped out. I did a slow walk around the area, maybe 100 feet in every direction. I didn't see anything. No tracks I could make out. No sign of anything broken or disturbed. Maybe I imagined it, but it didn't feel imagined. I made coffee, packed up a day pack, and figured I'd do a short hike. Maybe get my head right. There was a little ridge about an hour away I liked to climb. Gave a good view of the surrounding area. I left my tent and gear at camp, brought my water, some snacks, my knife, and a map. I knew the route by heart. I made it to the ridge and sat up there a while, watching the valley. Still no people. That always surprised me, how empty this place could be. I stayed up there until close to noon, then headed back down. When I got back to camp, I knew something was off before I saw it clearly. The tent wasn't where I left it. At first, I thought I was in the wrong place, but I knew I wasn't. I recognized the rocks near the fire ring, the way the creek curved. The tent had been moved or maybe dragged. It was about 20 feet downhill from where I left it, half collapsed. My bag was out of it, torn open. Everything inside had been dumped and spread around. I didn't see claw marks or any signs of chewing. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't unzip tents and open bags. My food bag was still hanging from a tree a ways off and hadn't been touched. Nothing was stolen, just messed with. I picked through the gear. My sleeping bag was shredded. Not cut, more like ripped by hand. The seams were split. My clothes were tossed, some shoved into the creek. My first aid kit was opened and emptied. Every item was there, just scattered. I stood there a long time trying to make sense of it. Then I felt it again, that weight, that feeling like I was being watched. I turned around slow. Didn't see anything, but it felt close. I packed up fast. Didn't even roll stuff, just jammed it into the pack. Tent was too torn to use again. I left it, took the essentials, strapped what I could, then headed back the way I came. It was only 2 hours to the truck, but it felt like 20. I kept turning around, thinking I heard something. A twig, a step, a breath. Once I made it back to the truck, I got inside and locked the doors right away. I sat there for a few minutes before starting it up. My hands were shaking. I didn't stop driving until I hit the first gas station outside the forest. There I checked my gear again. Everything was accounted for. Nothing missing, just disturbed. Like someone wanted me to know they'd been there. I reported it to the ranger station later that day. The guy there took notes, but I could tell he didn't know what to do with the story. There was no crime, no damage to property except my own gear. He suggested maybe a prank, maybe kids. But it wasn't kids. You don't hike 2 hours into a forest to mess with someone's sleeping bag. I haven't gone back to that spot since. I've camped in other places, closer to people, near trailheads with cell signal. But even then, I don't sleep as easy. I still hear those branches breaking, still feel that cold silence. And every time I zip my tent closed, I think about how easy it would be for someone to wait until I'm asleep and unzip it from the outside. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was a person. And I don't know what they wanted. That's what stays with me. Someone followed me, maybe watched me for hours, and they didn't take a thing. They just wanted me to know they were there.